Okay, and like I said at the beginning, Ashley Wennerstrom is with us today. She's going to present on the first series of, or the first session of our series, Incarceration, and I'm going to let her go ahead and take it away. Sorry, she's also one of our colleagues. She's been collaborating with MC, and she's in Louisiana.
Great, thanks so much. Well, hi everybody. It's nice to be here today and really nice to see a lot of friends here and colleagues. So yeah, I'm Ashley Wennerstrom. I live in New Orleans, work at LSU Health, I'm an associate professor there, and I do a lot of work with community health workers and many of you here today, and also do some work around incarceration and health. So y'all asked me to be here to talk a little bit today, so I'm going to do my best to get through my story. I can guarantee I'm going to cry a little bit. It's okay. I got my Kleenexes ready. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I care so much about this issue, and then talk about it kind of as a public health issue. So I'm going to share my screen if I can. I have 7 million things open because that's just how it goes. Everybody see that okay?
Yes.
All right. All right, so my story. So I'm gonna tell you about, again, why I care about this issue of incarceration and its relationship to health. So I grew up in Colorado. Oh, and I should say this real quick too. If you have questions as I'm talking, feel free to either shout them out or put them in the chat, because it's a lot of me talking, and I know that y'all are gonna have things on your mind. Anyway, so I grew up in Colorado. I moved to New Orleans in 2003 as a young child, basically. Just kidding, I was 23. Felt like a young child. And I joined AmeriCorps, and I worked at Habitat for Humanity, which is a program some of you may have heard of that helps low-income families build homes and purchase homes as a way to lift people out of poverty. And there were a couple of things that really struck me as I was working in AmeriCorps and noticing that the families that were going through this homeownership program is that they were all people of color, like not one single white family in the 2 years that I worked there. And so I started to get this idea like, something is wrong here in terms of, equity issues. And so that really stuck with me. And it started to inspire my interest in public health. So I ended up later going back to school in Arizona, getting a degree in public health. But the other thing that really struck me and ended up being life-changing was I met one of the homeowners, who's this man you see on the screen. His name is John Thompson, went by the nickname of JT. And he had been exonerated from death row. So got to learn a little bit about his life story, which the simple version is that he was wrongfully incarcerated. He was accused of a murder that he did not commit, and was sentenced to death in Louisiana's Angola prison. And he ended up spending 18 years incarcerated, 14 years on death row. And he finally was able to get free, thanks to the work of the Innocence Project. And what they were able to prove is that the district attorney who prosecuted him intentionally withheld exculpatory evidence that would have set him free. And this is really critical to understand. This was the district attorney, right, for the entire city of New Orleans, intentionally sent this man to death row. And when JT was finally freed, the district attorney, who was Harry Connick Sr., y'all may have heard of the musician Harry Connick Jr., famous piano player was Harry Connick Sr. He was asked about it, and he basically said, well, he's just one of those people that was going to get into trouble anyway, because JT had a few minor run-ins with the law, but basically was okay with the fact that he intentionally sent a person to death. And so that really, really stuck with me. I'd never really thought about the death penalty very much. It never even occurred to me that somebody could be exonerated from death row. Like, how does that even happen? It really made me think about the system of incarceration. And again, there was a really clear equity issue when we saw that this district attorney, who was a white man, was intentionally sending not only this Black man, but many others to prison, sort of regardless of whether they were guilty or not. So that really stuck with me. So in any case, like I said, I went back to school for public health, and I moved back to New Orleans in 2008, and I started working on a mental health focused project that involved community health workers. So that's kind of where some of this connection begins to the work that you all do. And we were doing outreach, training community health workers how to do outreach and education around the importance of mental health kind of in the post-Hurricane Katrina environment, because a lot of people had experienced issues with depression and anxiety after losing their homes and losing loved ones and just going through a really traumatic event. And JT happened to come to one of those training sessions that we were doing. And so he and I reconnected. And I learned that he had started an organization, a nonprofit organization called Resurrection After Exoneration, which was dedicated exclusively to helping people who were exonerated re-enter society. So if you think about what that means, there was a need for an entire nonprofit, not just focused on re-entry, but re-entry specific to people who were never even guilty of the crimes for which they were convicted. So that also, really stuck with me. Like, gosh, we clearly have a huge problem with incarcerating the wrong people. This is, not just JT as a one-off, but this is a systematic issue, right? So in any case, reconnected and got to be friends with JT, and I volunteered sometimes at his organization, and I was on their mailing list. And so one day he sent out an email that said, hey, we've got this showing of a film called In the Land of the Free, and it's about 3 men who've been incarcerated in solitary confinement for over 100 years total. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is totally wild. I've never heard of such a thing. What's solitary confinement? Do we even have solitary confinement in the US? Is that legal? Is that, I don't know, it just sounded so foreign to me, right? So I went to see the film, and I learned this film about the story of the Angola 3. And I'm just curious, has anybody heard of the Angola 3? Yeah, and I haven't either, which is totally, they may be familiar. But what I learned about, so we have this prison, Angola. It's called Angola because it is on a former plantation that was worked by enslaved people, enslaved Africans, many of whom were from the country of Angola, or what's known as Angola today. And the prison has persisted over the course of, decades and really centuries at this point. Starting as a plantation, but it turned into a prison. And it still has the vast majority of the people who are incarcerated there are Black men. And I was, learning about it in this film, and learned that even still today, people still work the fields at Angola. It's, again, primarily Black men. The guards are primarily white. And does anybody want to guess what the wages are that the people who are incarcerated are earning when they're picking crops in the Louisiana sun in 100 degrees?
$2 an hour.
2 cents an hour. 2 cents an hour still today. I could not make this up. So in any case, watching this film, and the time frame of this is back in 2011. I was watching this movie and learning about this. And I learned about this man, Herman Wallace, who you're seeing on your screen, and a couple of other guys who were incarcerated at Angola back in the kind of late 1960s and early 1970s. And when they were there, these are all Black men, it's important to state that, when they were there, the prison was still segregated, and there were no guards of color. It was exclusively white guards. So you can imagine how well that went. A lot of the guards were descendants of the former slave owners, like literally, just like family lineage, just going down all the way. And you can imagine that the treatment was not great for the people who were incarcerated. There was basically systematic rape of folks as soon as they would become incarcerated. We talked about the poor pay. The guards actually would ride around on horseback, and they're armed guards. So just absolutely deplorable conditions, really, really limited opportunities for people to visit with their friends and family members. Lot of corruption among the prison staff in terms of, bringing in contraband and all kinds of stuff. So just really, really, really bad conditions. And so there was some interest in improving the prison conditions, not surprisingly. So Herman Wallace and another man named Albert Woodfox decided to start trying to kind of organize the community among the people who were incarcerated. And you'll notice I'm trying very hard not to say the word prisoners and inmates. If I slip up and say those, forgive me, but those are, kind of common terms that we use to demean people who are incarcerated. So I really try to use people first language. In any case, they started organizing, and they had had some exposure to the Black Panther Party and learned about how kind of the 10-point plan of the Black Panther Party is about things like making sure that people have proper education, making sure that people have appropriately fair legal trials, making sure that people have access to food. It's really very similar to what we think about as social determinants of health today. So they ended up starting a chapter of the Black Panther Party while they were incarcerated. And what that looked like was a lot of organizing and education. So they taught people how to read. There were many, many men there who did not know how to read at all. So they taught them how to do that. They did political education classes and sort of learned about how they could be more involved in the political system, even from within the prison. They decided to start protesting some of the conditions that they were experiencing in prison. And so they did some things like they organized work stoppages. They did hunger strikes. And this is over the course of several years. But as they did this, the prison conditions started. So one thing that happened was that the prison was finally integrated. So damn, I said the word. Would just be, people overseeing people of color. They were able to get more visitation from their friends and family. And there's a lot of evidence that people who are incarcerated have better behavior. I hate to say that word too, because it sounds so condescending, but they're less likely to have disciplinary issues when they're able to see their family and friends. No surprise there. They're happier, right? Treated more like humans. Anyway, so they did a lot of important work to help integrate and organize the prison, improve the conditions, and it made them vastly unpopular with the administration, as I'm sure you can imagine. Meanwhile, there was another man named Robert King who was in Orleans Parish Prison at the time. He was also a known member of the Black Panther Party and was very similar to Herman and Albert in terms of his ideals, wanting to, fight for equality and fairness among people of color. And in 1972, while Herman and Albert were at Angola, there was a murder that was committed. There was a prison guard who was stabbed to death, Brent Miller. And they were immediately accused of the crime and thrown into solitary confinement in cells that are 6 feet by 9 feet. And so if you can imagine that, it's, think about the size of your bathroom. So they're thrown into these cells 23 hours a day and held there for quite a long time. And they were tried separately, which is very unusual because generally people who are accused of the same crime would have a trial together. And it later became very clear that there were a lot of issues with both of their, I should say explicitly, they were both convicted, found guilty, and sent back to Angola. They were not given the death penalty, which is surprising, but that's only probably because there was a moratorium on the death penalty in the US at that time, or else I'm quite certain they would have been sentenced to death. So in any case, they're sent back to Angola, and it came out that there were massive discrepancies and issues with both of their trials. There were eyewitnesses who actually were later found out to be legally blind. They were convicted by all white juries in the town where the prison is located. And so a lot of the people on the jury had friends and family who worked at the prison. There were later found to be witnesses that were paid for their testimony. And then the testimony in the two trials actually contradicted each other, so that if one person had actually been guilty, then there's no way that the other one could have been, and yet they were both found guilty. So basically sham trials. So they were framed for this murder. Again, sent back to Angola, and nowhere in their sentence did it say that they had to be held in solitary confinement. That was a choice that the prison administration made, but they put them in solitary. And then at the same time, I mentioned Robert King over in New Orleans, about 150 miles away. He ended up being sent to Angola, and because of his association with the Black Panther Party, he was accused of, or he was under investigation for being involved in this murder somehow, even though he was 150 miles away at the time, right? And he was also sent to solitary confinement. And so they were like, all right, what are we going to do? We have to do something. We all know we're innocent of this. Like, we are never going to cave. We're never going to stop fighting for our freedom because we know we didn't do this. And so years and years went on. They languished in solitary, but they continued their organizing as best they could. They continued to write letters to people on the outside. They read tons and tons of books to keep their minds fresh. Again, they were teaching people how to read. Like I recently met a man who said Albert Woodfox, Herman Wells's sort of compatriot, taught him how to read just from being in the cell next door. I mean, just wild stuff. Anyway, so they somehow managed to maintain their humanity and their sanity, and started to attract some supporters around the world who were interested in helping them. And they were able to litigate their cases from within prison, which was really, really impressive, able to get some representation. And they never let their cases die. And this is really important because a lot of times there's a statute of limitations on a case, and if you don't file something, your case is just dead and you don't have any more appeals. But they kept appealing and appealing and appealing. So they did this by themselves. Even before they got legal representation, they managed to do this. So the years go on and on and on and on and on. And at one point, through their advocacy and kind of raising awareness, they were able to get some representation that helped Robert King get out. He was the one that was at the other prison. So he had kind of the easiest case to say. He clearly had nothing to do with that. So he got out in 2009, I believe, I think. And in any case, he got out, and when he did, he'd spent 29 years in solitary confinement. 29 years. I know some of y'all are pretty young. That might be longer than you're alive. And he made this statement that, oh no, I'm wrong. He got out in 2001. But when he got out, he made the statement, I may be free of Angola, but Angola will never be free of me. And what he meant by that was that he was going to raise hell until he could help get his friends out. And so he did. He traveled all around the world. He told the story and said, hey, my two friends are, still sitting here in solitary confinement for something they didn't do. We've got to raise hell about this. And one of the things that came out of that was the documentary that I mentioned earlier called In the Land of the Free. And so when I saw this documentary, based on having known JT, I heard about this story, and this was in 2011. At this point, Herman and Albert had been in solitary confinement for 39 years. And I watched this movie and I was devastated. Like I couldn't imagine the lack of humanity that we have, that we could keep people locked up in those kind of conditions for that long. And I mean, anyone, certainly people who are innocent, and certainly people who care about all the same things that I care about. Again, I'm a public health person, and here they were fighting for equality, fighting for education, trying to make sure that there was peace and not violence. And I just had this feeling like I can't go home and pretend like I never saw this, and I know that we all see, horrific things all around the world all the time, right? It's all kinds of disturbing stories, but this one just really, really stuck with me. And I didn't know what to do. I was just a regular old person, just doing my little public health career. And I was like, well, I can be a nice person, I'll write them a letter. So I wrote Herman and Albert each a letter and just said, I heard about your story and your case, and, met Robert King at this screening, and just told him I supported him. And I got a letter back from Herman the next week, and it was just this absolutely beautiful letter. And he said, it's really interesting that you would choose to write me because we're neighbors. He said, I grew up one block from your address. So I lived in the 700 block of the street. He grew up in the 600 block of the street. And so it just really struck me and stuck with me. And we started corresponding over letters. And after about 3 months, and I have to say, he was so smart. I mean, I expected that somebody who'd been in solitary all this time would just be out of their mind. So well read, totally up on current events. We would have these great conversations through letter about music and art and politics and whatever else. And we just became really, really good friends. And after about 3 months, I said, this is just totally weird. I can't believe I'm like having this friendship with this person in prison who I've never met. And I said, I gotta go up and see you. And he said, great. So he arranged for us to have a special visit. And I went up, and it was just like what you see in the movies in terms of, you're behind the glass and the phone and the whole thing. As I walked in, the folks who worked at the prison were not kind at all. They gave me a very hard time because I wasn't officially on the list and it was a special visit. I had to obtain all these special permissions. I had to go through a background check. And then they gave me, you know, a full body pat down and the metal detector, and the whole thing's very dehumanizing, is the point I'm trying to make here. Just to even go in to visit a friend or a loved one in prison is a very dehumanizing experience. And then I got there and they brought him out, and he's 69 years old at this time and been living in solitary confinement for 39 years. Again, you can imagine he's not exactly like, you know, the most intimidating person in the world physically, right? They had him in ankle shackles, belly chain, and then handcuffs, with the handcuffs connected to the belly chain behind glass, and we had to talk through a phone. So again, just really, really dehumanizing, and it's not lost on me to see a Black man in chains on a former plantation, right? Very clear, very horrifying. So anyway, we had a wonderful conversation. We only had a 2-hour visit, but it was just like, we just had a super strong bond right away. We were buddies. And so he put me on this permanent visiting list. Sorry, my dog is making noise over here. Let her out. So I started visiting him all the time. So go up twice a month, which is as much as they would let me. And we just, we were just best friends. And here's a couple photos from our visits. But it was interesting when I first started visiting, he told me, I'm getting out of here, right? And I was like, oh yeah, whatever, right? He's like, no, I'm getting out of here. And what had happened was he filed a habeas corpus petition, which is basically the highest level you can go with the Supreme Court, the Louisiana Supreme Court. And he was just waiting for the ruling to come through. So again, I started visiting in 2011. He had had this habeas petition in since 2009. So he'd been waiting 2 years, and it's like, literally any day the ruling's going to come. I'm like, cool, when is it going to come? Well, then his judge died. And the entire docket got switched over to another judge. And so he's just waiting and waiting and waiting on this ruling, and it is just absolutely not coming. And after a little bit, I think it was probably spent like a year and a half into my time in visiting with him. He started losing weight, and he was, I'm not feeling well, something's off, I'm losing weight. Go to the doctor at the prison. And he went to the doctor and he got diagnosed with an infection, and he got diagnosed with this, and he got diagnosed with that, and he just was not getting better. And it was really striking to me because I could always see him every couple of weeks, and I'd come back and he would have lost 10 pounds or something. And he ended up losing, I think, about 60 pounds. And they finally were like, oh, whoops a daisy, you have liver cancer because you have hepatitis C that has never been treated. So, just absolutely did not give him the care that he needed or deserved. And so then finally, they sent him out for, treatment. And it was too late. I mean, he was in stage 4. It was very clear that he was going to die. And so he got sicker and sicker and sicker. And I continued to visit, and it got to this point where he knew he was going to die anyway. He literally had nothing left to lose. And so as he was waiting for this judge to make a ruling that he felt was never going to come, he decided to just write a letter to the judge, just pen and paper, like, hey, judge, could you please rule on my case, because I am literally dying and I would like to see freedom. His lawyers weren't too happy with him when he did that. That's not really how you're supposed to do things. And so they followed it up by filing a motion for expedited review. And when they did that, they were saying basically what he said, please rule on this case. And they knew that a judge is not going to let a dying person out of prison unless they had somewhere to go. And so Herman and I talked about it, his other friends, and I should be very clear, Herman had so many people who loved him. He had tons of friends, tons of family, tons of support, people who cared about him a lot. And he and I and friends and family decided that it would make the most sense for him to come to my house if he were to get out. And so we waited and waited, and he was so sick, we thought the ruling was never going to come, and it did. So after I had already said what I was sure was my final goodbye, I was driving to work one day. I got a call from his lawyers. It was like, okay, well, he's free to go. The judge ruled his conviction is overturned. The conviction was never valid. He was never guilty. Go pick him up. And his lawyers were like, many of them were out of town. Like, how do I go pick somebody up? They're like, oh, just send an ambulance. Like, oh, okay, cool. So apparently you can do that. You can call a private ambulance. So we did. So we sent ambulance up to pick him up, and by the time I got there, he his other closest friend and I went out, and the prison had turned away the ambulance. And they were like, no, you can't take him. We're not letting him go. We don't believe it. So what do? Well, the lawyers ended up calling the judge, and the judge filed a ruling, an additional ruling that said to the entire Louisiana Department of Corrections, like, let this man go right now, immediately, today, or the entire Louisiana Department of Corrections, including the warden himself, will be held in contempt of court. And so when they got that, they're like, all right, fine. So they finally let him go. The warden had come back to this was like hours and hours. The warden had come back to the prison. He was pissed off. But they finally had to let him go. And so they did. So this is him coming out of the prison on his little stretcher. So anyway, we ended up taking him to the hospital to get him stabilized, and I was his healthcare power of attorney, and they said, he's stable, but he's obviously dying. What do you want to do? Like, you should send him to a hospice facility because, he's going to die anyway. And like, you could do home hospice, but you're not really prepared since this was all so sudden. And I was like, guess what? There's no damn way in hell I'm sending this man to any other kind of facility. At this point, he'd been in a facility for 41 years of his life. Like, he's coming home. And so he came home to my house, and he was at this point kind of in and out of consciousness. But he knew where he was when I asked him when we got back to my house. I said, do you know where you are? And he said, yeah, your house. And we'd had this joke going on forever about how when he got to my house, he was going to take over the primary bedroom, and the guest bedroom wasn't going to be good enough for him. So we got to my house, and I got him in the house. I said, do you know where you are now? And he said, yeah, damn, guest bedroom. He still totally had his sense of humor. He wasn't in great physical shape. But in any case, he lived for a couple more days. Probably 50 or 60 people came over and got to say goodbye to him. He got calls from all over the country, and we just tried to make his last few days as pleasant as possible. Bought a bunch of flowers and held them all up to his nose so he could smell a rose and a lily, and just things that he hadn't experienced in all these years. And we read to him, we played music, and he literally died surrounded by his friends. The last thing I heard him say was, "I love you all." So really, really beautiful, really intense life experience. I share all of this with you, obviously, very deeply personal story, but I hope what you hear in here is not so much my tears, but rather this is a human being who was trying to do something good, trying to make this prison system a better place, and he was repeatedly denied the opportunity to be treated like a human being, really kept in a cage. And in spite of that, he never gave up hope. And he managed to just be an absolutely lovely human being in spite of so many systemic, I almost said failures, but it's not really failures because they were absolutely intentional. Albert Woodfox is the man you see over here. I was never as close to Albert as Furman, but he and I did exchange letters, and I was able to visit him several times while he was incarcerated as well. Absolutely lovely, lovely human being. So sweet, so smart, really, really good person. He, like I said, the trials were separate, so his legal case was very different from Herman. He ended up being retried several times and being convicted on more BS evidence, but he finally got out in 2016 on his birthday, which is super special. So he spent 44 years in solitary confinement. He passed away a couple years ago in 2022 from complications of COVID, but he was able to live several years of freedom and have a really incredible life. He had a partner who he had been with for many years, named Leslie George, and they worked together to write his life story in a book that's called Solitary. Highly recommend it if y'all want to read it. But yeah, Albert was great. So so that's that. Again, I just want to really emphasize that these stories illustrate systems. Again, they're very emotional stories, but this is the kind of treatment that people of color get in our carceral systems. Lack of appropriate healthcare, denial of basic human rights systematically. So I will stop this part of my story. And do y'all want to ask any questions or want to take a break? And then we'll go to the more intellectual um, pieces of why incarceration is a public health issue. Thoughts, questions? Nothing. I'm still everyone's silent.
I think it's hard to have anything to say. It's a quote unquote happy ending to a devastating situation that should have never existed.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for sharing. It's just hard to have anything to say, but thank you so much. I think maybe we could use a little break.
Yeah, should we take a little
In
break?
a little bit, but after whenever the team leaders think. But
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Yeah, actually, a break sounds perfect. Thank you so much for sharing. This was absolutely wonderful. And I think Faith put it in pretty good words about how this should have never happened. And it's unfortunate that it was completely intentional, but at least there was freedom in the end. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, I think that's perfect. Why don't we take like a 5-minute break and come back at like 45 and I can tell you some other stuff and we can move on from there?
Sounds perfect. Thank you so much.
Sure. All right, should we get started again?
Yes, I think we're good to start. Thank you.
All right, so what happened after a former Black Panther died in my house? Should be asking that question, right? So had a profound impact on my life, which should not surprise any of you. And part of that was on my work. So I'm just going to tell you this piece just real quick, and then I'll move into some broader stuff about mass incarceration in general. But as Herman was sick, I met this person right here. His name is Norris Henderson. I had heard of him before, but never met him. He's the executive director of an organization in New Orleans called VOTE, which stands for Voice of the Experienced. Norris was incarcerated for 27 years, also wrongfully. And while he was inside, he and several other guys, he was also at Angola, so he knew Herman. Should make that clear. They started a group called the Angola Special Civics Project, and they started litigating to help change some of the laws that would get them free. And they made a deal that whoever got out first, which happened to be Norris, would go home and start a nonprofit organization that would be specifically dedicated to restoring voting rights to people who have been incarcerated. So Norris got out in 2004 and started this organization called VOTE, which again works on making sure that people who've been incarcerated have political power. So they do all kinds of advocacy, legislation, litigation, cool stuff, and also help with re-entry. So I got to meet him, and I went back to work the next day after all this happened, and I worked at Tulane Med School at the time. And worked down the hall from this person, Anjali Niyogi. We'd never really had much of a conversation other than hi. But she's a physician, and she came up to me and was like, so something in the paper, what's going on with this whole thing? And, just told her the story that I just shared with you all. And she was like, we need to do something to help people get access to healthcare when they get out of incarceration. She had been working with a medical student to try to figure out how to take care of people better when they came home from incarceration, because they at the main state hospital where they were working, saw a lot of people who were incarcerated, but would come out for their care when they had a need that was too great to be delivered at the prison. And so Dr. Yogi and her student were like, but what about healthcare when people get out? Like, is there any connection? Do people get insurance? What does that look like? And so they decided they wanted to start a health clinic to help folks coming out of incarceration. And she's like, hey, you want to work with us on that? And I was like, I don't know anything about health clinics because I'm not a physician, but what I do know about is community engagement, and I can do qualitative research. And so we worked together with Norris at his organization VOTE to recruit people who had been incarcerated and talk about their experiences of getting healthcare afterwards. So we did a whole bunch of interviews with formerly incarcerated men and then formerly incarcerated women to learn about their healthcare needs post-incarceration. And then Dr. Niyogi started a program called the Formerly Incarcerated Transition Clinic, which employs formerly incarcerated community health workers. So there are a couple, one woman, one man. So they help people when they're coming out of incarceration, get connected to primary care, get access to medication. We have a really deranged system in Louisiana where, and I think this is the case in many states, where some of the healthcare providers in prisons are not fully licensed because they have, probably had some infraction themselves. And the only places they're allowed to practice medicine is in carceral facilities. And so that should raise some serious red flags. And one of the challenges for people who are getting out, they're discharged, and if they're on any kind of medication, sometimes the provider will write them a prescription saying, hey, here's your medication for your hypertension or whatever else. But those prescriptions are not valid because those are not licensed providers. So in any case, the FIT clinic that Dr. Niyogi started helps to address that issue by getting people hooked up with incarceration. So that's one thing that came out of it. And then this last photo over here, the man in the middle, my dear friend Bruce Riley, he's the deputy director at VOTE, where Norris works. And he and our other friend, Andrea Armstrong, who is a law professor at Loyola, the three of us worked together on a fellowship. We were lucky to get some funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to do a 3-year fellowship where we were looking at the conditions of healthcare within carceral facilities. So we were able to collect some interesting data and produce some legislative reports that hopefully will help improve access to care in our prisons in Louisiana. So that is that little quick piece. All right, so y'all know why I am passionate about this issue. You have heard probably more than you want, seen more tears than you care to see. But I do want to talk about this in this broader context. So, you don't have to care about my story, but why should you care about incarceration as a public health issue in general? We have 1.9 million people locked up in the United States. Does that number surprise anyone at all? No, you're familiar with that. Okay.
No, numbers are hard for me to picture. What is the population of the United States?
It's like 350 million, something like that.
Okay, so that's a large segment of the
It's a
population.
big chunk. And I'm going to show you a graph in a minute that'll help illustrate a little bit more. It's important to also note sort of where people are incarcerated. So, a little over half are people who are in state prisons, which are, if people are convicted of a crime in their state, a murder, a robbery, whatever, they'll generally go to a state prison. Some folks go to federal prisons if they're doing something that is, like across state lines or something like that, they'll go to federal prison. There are more, certainly not saying they're better, but there are more regulations on federal prisons because they have to be consistent throughout the country, whereas each state prison system is kind of, run like its own little system, right? So they can be very, very different, and they are. Local jails, I just want to highlight jails a little bit. So sometimes the words prisons and jails are used interchangeably. They're actually different. So prisons are usually places where people are going to serve a sentence of 1 year or longer. Local jails are usually for very short sentences or people who are awaiting trial and have not been able to post bail, either because they didn't have access to the funds because their bail was too high, or they weren't given access to bail at all. So the people who are in local jails generally are people who have not yet been convicted of anything, right? So the idea is innocent until proven guilty, but we do require people to stay in jail once they are charged, if they can't make bail or if they haven't been granted it. So important to think about that. We've got, over 500,000 people sitting in jails when they haven't been convicted of anything. It doesn't mean that they won't be, but this is, something to think about. And then over here, there's this little segment, also important to note how many people are in immigration detention. 34,000 people. So those are people who, are coming into this country without documentation. And, I can't say what everyone's experiences are, but as far as I understand, people go through absolute hell to enter this country, particularly those who have walked or, just, it's not easy to get here, right? And most people are fleeing really challenging circumstances. So in my humble opinion, not great to throw people into, a jail setting when they arrive. Anyway, so those are some of the numbers. So a lot of people locked up. All right, so what does this mean? How does this relate? And I wanted to share this graph with you all. So the United States incarcerates more people per capita than any other country in the world. So we are the incarceration capital. And you can see, I usually do the slide with Louisiana, but since y'all mostly, or many of you are in South Carolina, I added your state. So you can see that, on average, we're the highest in the world, but the South Carolina rate is even higher than the rest of the United States. So that should be shocking. So the numbers are kind of hard to process, but you can at least place South Carolina in this context of y'all got a lot of people locked up. We've got you beat in Louisiana. We unfortunately are the incarceration capital of the world. We have the highest rate of all the states. So our number here is over 1,000. It's pretty shameful. So, how did this happen, or how does this come to be, and what does this look like? So I know that you all, in the work that you do, are very concerned about racial equity, which is wonderful. We should be concerned. Just wanted to show you a little bit about what things look like in terms of prison and jail rates in South Carolina. This is the most recent data I could find without super digging. But you can see very disproportionate rate of incarceration, or at least, higher numbers, people who are Black or American Indian, Alaska Native. And then we see sort of a similar trend in jail rates. And then we can look in terms of, what percentage of the population are people. So among just South Carolina residents in general, 63% of folks are white. But white folks are only making up 37% of the jail population, or excuse me, the prison population, and 49% of the jail. And then we can see the disproportionate representation of people who are Black in prison, when they make up 26% of residents, but 59% of people in prison and 48% in jails. Luckily, and somewhat surprisingly, the Hispanic population or Latinx population is not overrepresented in prisons and jails. So that's good news. But it doesn't mean that couldn't change. Somebody put some in the
But
chat.
that's just South Carolina. That's not all states.
Correct. That's South Carolina. And Rich is asking the question, do states in the South have higher incarceration rates as a whole? Yes. Good question. I'm not going to go into all of this because we could be here for a long time, but do want to mention that we've seen a huge increase in incarceration among women in recent years. Oftentimes we think about people who are in prisons or jails, we tend to think about men. They vastly outnumber women, but we're seeing a large increase in incarceration among women. So let's talk a little bit about why we're seeing all of this. Why do we see this disproportionate? First of all, why do we see so many people in prisons in the first place, and then why do we see disproportionate representation of people of color in prisons and jails? One of the issues is policing. Can y'all think about anything that you've heard about in the news, anything you've experienced that would indicate unfair policing practices?
That they have a quota of like pulling over people. So towards the end of the month, they're just doing it more.
Okay, certain police forces may have that. What else?
In a crowd, my son is at the University of South Carolina, and in a crowd down in 5 Points, he may be the only person of color in his friend group, and he's the only one that gets patted down, questioned before they enter clubs and things.
Okay, great. Yeah, and there is evidence that in a lot of police training, they'll have people have police, have to, say how they would interact with a suspect and things like that. And almost always the suspect or the person that they should be arresting or questioning is people of color. Like it becomes ingrained in their mind that those are going to be the quote unquote bad guys, right? Rich, I see you put 287G. I'm not familiar with that.
And I'm not an expert on the policy, but my understanding is that it allows police agencies to act as an extension of immigration policy systems and detain people or question someone's status in the country if they have a broken taillight and they're able to pull them over.
Okay, great. Yeah, good example, right?
And they can move them immediately to deportation.
Is that a South Carolina policy or is that national?
It's federal, but like local jails can choose to implement it.
And they have to, in South Carolina now, if you're sent to a local jail, they have to hold you and notify ICE, and they have 48 hours for ICE to respond before they can release you. My ex-husband was hit by a car, and the man driving the other car died, and they arrested him and held him for ICE. And fortunately, for some reason or another, ICE never showed up, and he was allowed to post bail, even though it wasn't his fault. That he was hit in this accident. And so a lot of times if the detention centers that hold immigrants are full, ICE won't respond to things like these. But if they have open beds, because they're paid by the federal government per bed that's full, they will go pick up inmates or people that have been sent to local jails.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Faith. I'm really sorry to hear that happened to your family. But these are all perfect examples of how we see sort of racism embedded in policing, right? I will also mention some other kind of ongoing things like folks may have heard of stop and frisk policies that basically in some places allow police officers to literally stop and harass anybody they want to on, suspicion of them doing something wrong. And when you look at who they choose to stop, it is disproportionately people of color. I would also ask the question, let's say y'all wanted to get some drugs. Let's say we wanted some good drugs. We're gonna have a good party tonight. Where would you go to get your drugs? Where are you gonna find the most drugs? What kind of community?
A nursing home, sorry.
Oh, okay, interesting. Yeah, could be. Where do people usually think you're gonna find the most drugs?
An African American.
Okay.
Yeah, like the black neighborhoods or whatever.
Absolutely, that's the stereotype, right? And those are the areas that get policed. Where do you actually find the most drugs? Anybody know?
In the white neighborhood.
Rich places.
When
You're
I
on the
was
right
growing
track.
up, it was with my rich white friends.
Okay, rich white
Yes.
friend. Okay, any
Right.
particular age group?
College.
Yes, if you want good drugs, they're gonna be on college campuses. And I know I'm being silly, but it's true. Like literally, the highest rates of drug use that occur in the United States are on college campuses. And so I always have to ask myself, well, gee, why is it that we don't see the police kicking in the doors at dorms, right? Why aren't we dragging out college kids in handcuffs? Well, why is it that most colleges have their own independent, separate police force? Who would that benefit?
It doesn't clog up the local system, and then they can also, quote unquote, take into consideration the child's future, the child's priors, the child's family income, all that other stuff.
Right, the child who's 18 to 22, likely if they're living on a college campus, right? But we treat college students differently because they are generally from wealthier families. Colleges do not want to have local police arresting their students. That would not go well for getting donations from wealthy patrons and parents and stuff, right? So we know that there is disproportionate policing of communities of color, and to be clear, I'm not suggesting that anybody should be getting arrested for, minor drug violations, but point being that things are policed, very differently. We're intentionally not policing college campuses, which are, often very white. So policing is unfair. Once we get people arrested, we send them to jail, right? And then they have the option to be assigned bail in many cases. There is lots of evidence that people of color are disproportionately assigned higher bail. So it's difficult for folks to get out. So if you're already poor, you may not be able to post bail, and then you're just going to sit in jail until your trial date comes up. What happens to your life when you are in jail?
It stops.
It stops, right? If you've got kids, they're probably going to get taken away. You're probably going to lose your job. You are probably going to lose your housing, whether because you're renting or you can't afford your mortgage, whatever. If you've got pets, if you've got medication that you might be on, don't think that you're going to automatically get that medication, right? People's lives go to hell while they are awaiting their trial. And if they can't afford bail, yeah, I'm seeing quality of life goes down. Oh yeah, I'm just seeing Faith's comment also. When they send police out to break up college parties, they generally don't arrest anyone. Very true. So we've got folks waiting in jail. Their lives are generally, not going in a good direction. If they can't afford bail, they probably also can't afford a lawyer to help them. And so they often end up with a public defender. What do we know about public defenders?
They don't try cases, they just plead them because they don't have the time.
Absolutely.
They don't have the time to, because the caseloads are so large, they don't have time to spend time on each individual case. So most of the time, the public defender only meet you the day or the week before your trial.
100% right. And I want to say I have been friends with public defenders. I've sent my students to do practicum experiences at the public defender's office. Public defenders themselves have in many cases gone to the best law schools. They work their tails off. They are smart, good, hardworking people who care a lot about their clients. But because public defense systemically is funded very, very poorly, these folks are making no money and they have massive caseloads. So they do not generally have time to take their clients to trial. And so they tell them, you got to take a plea, right? Or else we're going to go to trial and be unprepared and you're going to get convicted. So people often are in a situation where the best thing they can do, even if they're innocent, is take a plea. which is really problematic. So we've got a poor public defense system because of funding, not because of the public defenders themselves. When we look at issues around sentencing, we see again and again, people of color are disproportionately sentenced to longer times in prison. And one example of that was prior rules regarding sentencing for powder cocaine versus crack cocaine. Exactly the same drug. The only difference is that crack is cut with baking soda, and it is less expensive and more predominantly used in communities of color, whereas powder cocaine is more frequently used in white communities. And what we saw for many, many, many years was that you basically have to have 10 times as much powder cocaine to get the same sentence as somebody with crack cocaine. So it led to much longer sentences for people of color, right? So all of these things, and this is not a comprehensive list, but all of these things are contributing to mass incarceration. And then I want to touch on one other thing that's not on the slide, and Faith mentioned it kind of briefly, but there are financial incentives in many cases for people to keep folks in jail, and specifically jail. So I'll give you the example of Louisiana. Among all of our state prisoners, about half of them are held in local jails because we had a problem with prison overcrowding. And so the local jails, and like the Sheriff's Association said, hey, you know, we're happy to keep folks in our local jails that are small, that maybe don't have good healthcare facilities, because we will get paid, and they get paid on a per diem basis. And in New Orleans alone, you hear story after story, and I'm sure this is true in other cases as well, but of people getting arrested and posting bail, but they don't get out until 12:01 the next day, because then the sheriff will get paid for keeping that person incarcerated, right? So there can be financial incentives. And then I strongly encourage folks, I wish we had more time to talk about it, but encourage folks to read about issues related to prison labor. I mentioned the folks at Angola who are working in the fields making 2 cents per hour. There are people all over the country who are working for very, very low wages, and prison systems, you know, sell the goods that people who are incarcerated make, and make money. So there are a lot of financial incentives for prisons and companies to want to keep people incarcerated.
Hey, Ashley,
Yeah.
are local jails allowed to be privatized, or is that only federal?
Local jails, yeah, I think they can be privatized. I don't see why not. Federal jails are, state prisons are. I think it's just a matter of whether a local entity, so say, you know, a city or a county, if they want to run their jail themselves, or if they want to contract out to somebody to do that. It's a good question. And I will say a lot of the prisons and jails have privatized their healthcare systems within prisons and jails. Good question. All right, so let's talk a little bit briefly about what happens when you get out. And yes, Alex, I agree with you. For-profit prisons should not exist. That is not a good thing. Okay, so it's important to keep in mind the connection between prisons, slavery, and voting rights. So when we think about the history of this country, we had a lot of ways that we creatively, I'm saying we as in, you know, the government, kept people of color from voting. Things like poll taxes, literacy tests, you know, requirements for land ownership, all kinds of stuff, right? People could not vote. But now that we have mass incarceration, predominantly people of color, there have been rules instituted at many state levels that keep people from having full access to voting rights after incarceration. So there are a couple of states, Maine and Vermont, where people who are incarcerated can vote literally like from their prison facilities. They don't really have a whole lot of folks locked up there, so it doesn't have a huge impact. And then there are some states where people have permanent disenfranchisement if they have a felony conviction. So we've got our friends in Virginia over here. Florida used to be one of those states. And what do we have? Louisiana is kind of a weird situation, very much because our friends at Vote did advocacy to change the laws. Voting rights are automatically restored after release from prison and parole. For some places, people have to petition to have their right reinstated. But when you think about what this means, we lock people up, they, supposedly serve their time, we send them out, and then in many states, we're saying, you don't get to vote anymore, or it's going to be really difficult for you to vote, or you can't vote if you're on probation or parole. We're systematically disenfranchising people of color. And then we really think about what states that's happening in, it becomes super problematic. We know Florida has been the deciding state in national presidential elections. Let's look at Iowa. They have the first caucuses, right? They have a huge influence in national elections. So just, be thinking about this, be aware of this, that there's a huge connection to this systematic practice that we've really always had in the United States of keeping people of color from having full voting rights. And then I'm just going to go through a few more quick slides about some other important things to know about incarceration. So know that people who are incarcerated have much higher rates of many health conditions, 2 to 3 times the rate of chronic diseases, 3 to 4 times the rate of serious mental illness. Huge connection, and I'm sure y'all know this, but between mental illness and people becoming incarcerated for any number of reasons. We have criminalization of mental illness, criminalization of homelessness. People just doing what they have to do to get by and, lands them in jail. Infectious conditions like HIV, hepatitis B, hep C, and tuberculosis are about 10 times higher among the incarcerated population. And health care is often inaccessible and expensive for people who are incarcerated. Constitutionally, people who are incarcerated are guaranteed the right to health care. In practice, it doesn't happen because they sometimes, in many cases, have to pay. And so I can tell you in Louisiana, historically, the practice has been that people have to pay a $3 copay in order to see a doctor. How much are they making an hour? 2 cents. So do the math. How many hours would somebody have to work in order to go to the doctor? So many hours, right? So people don't go. And another important point to make is the way that healthcare is delivered is on what's called a sick call system usually. So we don't see, oh, gee, you're going to get an annual exam, every year, and we're going to check you for everything. It's like you can go to the doctor when you get sick. In Louisiana, people who are under the age of 50 do not get an annual exam at all. So you can imagine never going to your doctor until you're 50. And people, are getting locked up at very young ages. So they're having to pay for healthcare. And this is not unique to Louisiana. Every state's a little bit different. Obviously, I know Louisiana best because I'm here, but find out what the system is in South Carolina or the other areas where y'all live, but healthcare is not always accessible for folks who are incarcerated. Also really important to, when we think about incarceration, to realize that we're not just looking at the effects on the individuals who are incarcerated. So close to 3 million kids have a parent in federal or state prisons. A lot of the women in particular who are incarcerated are moms. I think I'm not going to tell you a percentage because I'll be wrong, but it's a very, very high percentage. And kids who have incarcerated parents are less likely to complete college, and they have higher rates of lots of conditions, including ADHD, obesity, anxiety, depression, and asthma. So it has a real effect. This is a survey that was done several years ago about, it was done among families who have loved ones incarcerated and sort of what that means. And so you got to think about what does it mean to have a member of your family go from being in a home to incarcerated? Well, income, might go way, way down, especially if that person was a primary breadwinner. Having loved one in prison is expensive. Oftentimes you're paying for lawyers. That's expensive. Oftentimes you are going to visit your loved one. That might mean taking time off of work. You should know that in many, many, many places, prisons are far away from cities. So for example, I've been talking about Angola prison. That's about 2.5 hours away from New Orleans. It's about 1.5 hours away from Baton Rouge, our big cities. So just in order to get there, that can be a whole day experience. You might have to stay overnight somewhere in order to go see your loved one. So it can be very, very expensive. Phone calls are expensive. Depending on where you are, rates can be anything from a couple dollars to $5 for a 15-minute phone call. So that adds up really, really quickly. And so that obviously is money that's being taken away, from family income. So among this particular survey, 2 in 3 families said they had difficulty meeting their basic needs. People lose housing, it's pretty striking. So just wanted to share that. And then this was a study that came out very recently that I found stunning, I'll say, which is that people with incarcerated immediate family members have a reduced life expectancy. So if you have, a parent, a sibling who's incarcerated, your life expectancy will be roughly 2.6 years lower. And then if you have more than 3 immediate family members who are incarcerated, that can lead to almost 5-year lower life expectancy. Pretty intense. And then finally, we want to think about the effects on communities in general. What I'm showing here, and again, I'm sorry, this is so Louisiana centric. This is just, what I'm a community health person, right? I know my community best. But this is a map of New Orleans. And this was done, it's called the $1 Million Block Project. And what they're trying to do is show how much money is being spent annually on keeping people incarcerated who are from any given block. So this is kind of a larger zoom out, and then these are a few blocks. But like as an example, this particular block spending $500,000 a year roughly on keeping people just from this block incarcerated. And it's really wild to think about, like, what could that $500,000 go to other than incarceration? Could it be going to, I don't know, 500 grand in a block? Like, you could make a new library, you could make a park, you could give everybody cash subsidies, you could bring in make a community garden. There's so much great stuff that could be done. But we're spending all this money on, a system that's really punitive and not necessarily, doing any good at all for our communities. So that's all the slides I have. It looks like we've got about 12, 13 minutes left. So totally happy to answer questions, have a dialogue. I know y'all have lots of great experiences and lots to think about. And of course, my contact information is there if you want to track me down at any point.
Thank you so much, Ashley. If everybody feels comfortable, we can continue to record for this next portion with everybody's questions, or if you'd like, we can also stop the recording here since the educational portion is now completed. Can't see everybody's faces, but I'm going to assume that everybody's still okay with it. Ashley, are you still okay with recording? Okay. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. That was an awesome presentation. I am shook. I can't believe it.
My pleasure. Yeah, I know we covered a lot in a really short amount of time, and it's a lot of stuff that's very distressing, and I'm just like going through it all very quickly because I'm used to it. But yeah, it might take some time to let some of this sink in. I'm seeing Faith's question: are there resources that show the money being earned from incarcerated persons' labor? I would start with the Prison Policy Initiative website. They've got a lot of incredible information, including like the maps I showed you of incarceration in South Carolina. And they've got great links, so they probably have something.
What was the website?
Prison Policy Initiative. I'll put a link in the chat. Yeah, it's just prisonpolicy.org. They've got all kinds of awesome stuff. Beat me to it. There it is. Thoughts, questions?
Actually, I'm wondering if you could share with us, like some of the, so I know that there are some programs where they have specific community health workers who are formerly incarcerated, had been formerly incarcerated, and are helping other people adjust in that transition time and get connected to resources and stuff. And that you guys also have that clinic where you were providing healthcare. So could you talk a little bit more about like, what are some of the major issues that folks are seeing, and what do you know about like CHW programs that are successful, around the country, like that transitions clinic or different things where they have CHW specifically for serving that population?
Yeah, sure. So, for most public health problems, I think that CHWs are the answer. And I think it's certainly the case in re-entry. So there is a program started in California called the Transitions Clinic Network, where they have worked, I don't know the numbers offhand, but worked very, very closely with many of their prisons and jails to get referrals from people who are coming out of incarceration, and then they hire CHWs to get people into clinics. I'm not going to say what I was thinking. It's a great program. They train CHWs specifically who are formerly incarcerated. And then they also provide support for other clinics around the country too. So they're called, I think it's, yeah, you got the website there, transitionsclinic.org. You can look on there and see if they have one in South Carolina. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure they have one in North Carolina. But it's, like all community health worker models, just having that trusted person, somebody who's literally been through the experience of being incarcerated and who understands the nuances of reentry, just super, super helpful. In terms of what we have seen here in Louisiana, so our two community health workers, I'm saying they're not mine, I don't work for this program. They're people I'm lucky to know. Haki Sakua and Danielle Metz are the community health workers. They both were locked up for a very, very long time. Haki was at Angola, the prison I've been talking about, and Danielle was in a federal prison in California for many years. They, I think, just have the capacity to talk to people in a way that nobody else can. Like just having that experience of incarceration makes all the difference in the world. The things that they tend to help people with are, again, just like getting connected to primary care. I think so many people don't get good health care when they're in prison for, a number of reasons. So just getting people in, like getting them into the system is super important. Helping people get enrolled in Medicaid is really, really important. What was I going to say? In the interviews that we did with both formerly incarcerated men and women, one thing that really stood out is how much people were interested in healthcare. I thought maybe people would be sort of disengaged, but actually really wanted to get a good checkup on the outside. A lot of times they didn't trust the prison providers, and I think for valid reasons. So people are very interested and engaged in care, and it was really remarkable to hear about a lot of the things people do within prisons to try to stay healthy in terms of diet and exercise and home remedies and supporting each other. But anyway, so folks are very interested and engaged in care. So that's something that CHWs do a lot. And then I think there are just so many barriers that folks might not know about or think about when we're thinking about reentry. I mean, a lot of people can't get jobs. Just, it's so hard to apply for a job because there's almost always that box of, have you ever had a felony conviction, and you have to check yes, and then your application goes, straight into the garbage. So when you can get paired with a CHW who knows about local organizations or businesses that are willing to hire formerly incarcerated folks, that helps a lot. I think another big issue that CHWs can help with is housing. Very, very difficult to find housing, public housing in particular, because usually they won't provide housing for people who have been incarcerated. And there also are a lot of restrictions on who can even be in the home. So let's say that, you get out of prison and you want to go stay with your mom, and she's in public housing, she won't be allowed to have you be there. So it's not only like you can't be the person who's the renter, but it's like nobody can have a history of incarceration. So, CHWs can help navigate that. And then another thing that we have seen some success with in New Orleans is, and I'm sure that there are things similar in other areas, but our peer support groups. So there's one in New Orleans that's run by a man named Thad Tatum, who is just an absolute sweetheart. He was locked up for like 27 years. And he has a degree in substance abuse counseling, and he's just really, really passionate. So as a volunteer for years and years and years, he has run this peer support group. So it's mostly a bunch of guys who were locked up together in Angola. They get together every other Tuesday and just talk about their experiences, try to process it. They invite their friends and their family members to come. So it's open to anyone, which they usually say is super, super helpful, because sometimes, particularly, again, it's mostly men. There are a few women that go to it, but a lot of time the partners of the formerly incarcerated folks, the wives or girlfriends, don't understand what the guys are going through. And so when they come to the peer support group and they hear, everybody's facing these same challenges, it starts to, make sense to them. So I think peer support is a big role that CHWs play. Yeah. So just, kind of the usual, getting people into care, navigating social determinants, but just with that particular lens and understanding the additional barriers that formerly incarcerated folks face.
Thank you,
Are there
Ashley.
ways?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Are there ways that you have found that are successful for, improving compassion and empathy for people that are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated? Because there's so many people that don't treat them like humans, like that's not even in their mind, like, oh, well, they deserve to be treated any way anybody wants to treat them, whether they're guilty or not. And I don't understand how to improve that empathy, if that makes sense.
I totally agree with you. And I think it's a really big challenge. And I don't have an easy answer for it, but I think it's stories. I mean, honestly, I think it's stories. You have to hear stories. For me, it was going into a prison, right? And like seeing someone. And I can't tell you how many times I sat in a prison visiting room and watched men with their children, like their little babies sitting on their laps. And I saw them on Mother's Day with their moms and, on Easter with the whole family there. And you see, these are just regular people. They may be guilty of something that the system set them up to do. But I think we have to do a better job of shifting the narrative. And I think that comes through storytelling. I think it's from people who are incarcerated telling their stories about, first of all, why they were incarcerated, and second of all, the dehumanization that they faced in order to try to really get across the point that cruelty should not be part of a sentence. If we truly believe that we need to send people away to prison because they've been quote unquote bad, it doesn't mean they should be treated like less than human. But yeah, I don't have an easy answer to it. We'll get there.
Thank you, Ashley. That was very insightful. And I absolutely agree. Storytelling is really important to be able to get the point across to people who aren't experiencing these circumstances or have never had a family member in these types of situations, especially when we're trying to advocate for the greater population and really minimize those inequities that we see in healthcare and injustices and racial discrimination and systemic problems that we face as a country. I think that this is a good way to go ahead and wrap up. If anybody, or Ashley, if you have any final thoughts that you would like to share with the group, please go ahead.
Yeah, first and foremost, feel free to reach out if there's anything I can do to be helpful. Thanks everybody for participating and for all your great questions and insightful comments and for letting me cry a little bit. I was just going to add one other thing, which is I hope that we can get to a place where people who have loved ones who are incarcerated can talk about it more, because I think that changes the narrative too when we hear like, oh, so-and-so at church, son is locked up and, she's a good person. She's a good mom. Like, what went, what happened there? So I think we've got to talk about it and humanize people more. But yeah, I think also, I'll just say this last piece, engaging the right legislators is important. So we've had luck when we have presented, I mentioned the folks that vote like Bruce, my colleague Andrea, when we have presented to information on health related to incarcerated, presented to the health and welfare committees as opposed to criminal justice committees. So, try to find the legislators who have a little bit more of an orientation towards compassion and care, but we'll continue to do the work that we do as public health people, shift the narrative when we will get there. So thanks everybody for the opportunity to be here today. I commend you all for taking on this really tough topic, and hope to see you all again soon.
Yes, thank you so much, Ashley. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Everybody, thank you for being here. I want to share with everybody that we will be taking our summer break like we did last year. And so we will reconvene in September. I will send out an email to everyone to have this information in writing. And I will also share the resources and the link to the recording with everybody. Again, Ashley, thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful.
Pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity. Take care, y'all.